you would state your name and when you worked at Newnan High School.
My name is Amelia Adams. I was Mrs. Woodruff at that time, and I taught here from 1966 to 1971. I was fresh out of college when I came. So, you know, a lot of times the kids didn't realize I was a teacher. In fact, the funniest thing that ever happened, I think, in my whole career here, a young man who was very lively came up behind me. I was coming up the stairs and just grabbed a handful of my derriere. And he turned around. When I turned around, he said, "I'm dead. I'm absolutely dead." And I said, "Don't ever do that again." But that was kind of interesting. But that happened a lot, you know, with young teachers. Mm-hmm. Not that sort of thing, but, you know, the hardest thing, I think, was, since they were just the students I taught, some of them were just 4 years younger than I had to be, you know, mature and look like the leader, and that wasn't always easy.
So, what led you to become a teacher specifically at Newnan High School?
Well, may I tell you first why I wanted to be a teacher, I guess. I became a teacher because I always loved to learn, and from the time I can remember, I could read. And so I fell in love with books, and when I went to school, I fell in love with school. And my father did not receive a college education. He was in the war, and after the war he had responsibilities, so he couldn't go to college. So he reared me to understand that I had to be as well educated as possible, and he had very, very high demands, and I tried to meet them. And along the way, although I grew up in a small town, really smaller than Newnan, I had exemplary teachers. And when I went to college, particularly in history, I was extremely well prepared. And in those days, quite honestly, there were not as many avenues to careers as there are now. I don't know what I would have done if I had been growing up as you all are now. But at any rate, I decided, when I went to college, I did not know whether I would be an English teacher or a history teacher. I knew that I wanted to teach high school students because I was not naturally drawn to little children. So that was, at the time, I didn't realize how ambitious that was. And I went to Mercer University. And I got, in those days, if you taught high school students, you had to get what's called a pure degree. You had a degree in English, and then you got a minor in education, which is very different from nowadays. I had a major in English and a minor in journalism. And I married a Newnan boy, so when I graduated from college, and I had a one-year-old child when I came to Newnan. And I loved it. I really did. I loved Newnan High School.
What would you say was the most enjoyable part of your job?
Well, I've always told my students, and I taught 35 years, and I taught mainly seniors for the last 20 years or so, and I always told them that teaching for me was very selfish because it was like being in a book club. And every day I got to go to book club and talk about beautiful literature, and I didn't like writing quite as much as I liked the literature part, and I liked grammar and order and that kind of thing. So I would have to say the best part of teaching was being able to revel in the subject that I loved and still do. I have a book in my pocketbook right now in case I had to wait. So I loved that. I really loved that, and I think that when some of my students in Monroe, where I taught, they did, the University of Georgia came in and did an interview with them, and they said, "What's the most important thing about a teacher?" Answer that question for me. What's the most important thing about the teachers you enjoy the most?
When they're interested in it.
And you love what you teach.
Mm-hmm.
And I did. And I think that I got so excited every day when I would teach, say, Othello or read romantic poetry or whatever. I would be so excited. And I hope that spilled over to the kids because I just loved it. I loved standing at a podium and teaching. Nowadays that's not as acceptable. We're supposed to do all these interesting things, you know. But I love that part of it. I really did.
What do you think is the relationship between Newnan High School and the community?
Oh, I don't think that I'm very well equipped to answer that. I moved away, and I've only lived here at 4 years after I moved back, and so I have a void of all those years. Plus, after I taught here, I went to the Heritage School and taught there, and my oldest son graduated from Heritage. So my knowledge of the Heritage community, even now, is probably greater than the knowledge of what Newnan High means to the community. But I will try to answer it as best I can. I think that Newnan has always been a highly respected school in the community. I think they've been known for very good teachers, and I remember telling someone that the schools in Coweta County, by and large, did not suffer since 2008 the way other school systems had, because you had visionary leaders, which isn't very important to you all in your day-to-day life, but it's very important in taking care of you and what you're able to learn, the quality of the teachers you have. And if you ever move back here, when you have your own children, it will be extraordinarily important. Newnan has always had good athletic teams. The students participate in the community. And when Mr. Quisenberry told me about the size of the history club and so forth, that sort of thing was very, very impressive to me. And I keep up with this high school in the newspaper, and I see, you know, the strides that you all make. I always read about students, well, not just from this school, but from all schools, because education is still a love of mine.
What would you say has always made Newnan High School a special place to attend school?
Well, when I walked in the building about 2 or 3 years ago, I went down to Miss Landreth's room because she and I talked together then. She came a few years before I did. But the school, the plan itself is virtually unchanged. I just went down the hall and looked in on my classroom where I taught, right across the hall. And it's just the way it was when I came here in 1966. With, a few changes, I'm sure. There are computers in the room and all that sort of thing. But it's relatively unchanged. And I think that gives a sense of character to the school. And do you all like the building? And do you wish you had a fresher, more modern school?
I don't think anything's wrong with what we have.
You know, the last years that I taught, this was really sweet. The last 20 or so years I taught school, I went back to the school where I went to high school and taught in my favorite teacher's room. Now that was really special. Mm-hmm. And I taught in that building up until the last few years that I did teach. And we moved to a brand new school, state of the art. And it just didn't have the pull to me emotionally. And I'm not one who objects to change, but there was just something special about the old building, and there's really something special about this one.
Awesome. So since you were teaching during desegregation, do you think that it took time for the students to adjust to desegregating?
It didn't take time for the children to adjust. It took time for their parents to adjust. What we did, and I told Mr. Quisenberry this, and you may have already heard this, but after the first year I was here, we separated the classes to boys and girls. Have you heard that? No. Well, to prepare for integration, we knew it was coming. And we didn't know what to expect. You have to realize that everybody who taught here went to school where there were no black teachers, no black students. We knew each other in town, but, you know, I never had any black friends my whole life. They had another school, and I was reared in a small town. So it was something very, very new for us. And in trying to anticipate what to expect, they divided the classes into boys and girls. Let me tell you, teaching 35 ninth grade boys is something else. And I had them paddled when they were, by the football coaches when they would misbehave. But at any rate, that's what we did to prepare. And so when the children came, the first year, we didn't have, there were very, very few students. And then the last year I was here, we integrated the classes with boys and girls. There weren't any, you know, I taught ninth grade. And I think that I might have had 2 black students in my English class of, say, 30 kids. And I decided that I would seat them alphabetically. That was the best thing I knew to do, because then I didn't want to put the 2 black kids together and make them feel, you know, really singled out. So that's what I did. Nobody had a problem, and there was one black young man that I remember, and he may have been the only one in my class. He was beautifully groomed, just polished and spit-shined. I knew his mother creased his pants and creased him, and he looked like a bandbox. And he was seated in front of a white girl. And it was a Friday night, and the phone rang, and it was an angry father. And he said, "If you don't move my daughter away from that blank, I'm going to come over there and make you move her." So I called the principal, because my husband didn't feel comfortable about it. Because, of course, the only thing he could think about was, I don't want anybody to harm you. So as a precaution, they put a policeman outside my room for that week. And about the 3rd day that the policeman was here, the girl who was seated in the back of the black boy came up to me, and she said, "Ms. Woodruff, I am so ashamed of my father." She said, "There is nothing wrong with that young man who sits in front of me. And I am just embarrassed that he has caused all this trouble." And I said, "Well, darling, it's not your fault. Your father, like so many people, is just having to adjust to something he's never lived through before." That had nothing to do with my going to the private school. It was just an exciting opportunity, because it was the first year, and you know, I could go and help choose the textbooks. It was very exciting. But I'll have to say, a few years later, when I moved into a highly integrated, very almost inner city type school, even though it was a small town, I never had any trouble with my black students until the latter part of my teaching career, and that was just due to belligerence, and a lot of people experienced it, and I had the same problem with some of my white students. They just weren't as polite and respectful, and I think that's why I really eventually stopped teaching. I just couldn't bear it. I was a very strict teacher, and I had high standards, and I just I couldn't endure it. But I always said that my black students understood my humor a lot better than my white students, and I had many black students who'd gone on to tremendously successful lives. And but when I went to the other school, integration was thoroughly established, and I never had a problem. Never ever had a problem. So it was an interesting time. As I said, I think the most valuable thing I would say is this was something totally new to everybody. You know, it was just as if you all were, somebody told you all, you know, half this school is going to Russia now and go to school, and you wouldn't know what to expect. When you got there, you'd probably find that they were very much like you, and very accepting you despite the politics of their parents. And I think that's what I see, and I'm not being critical of parents, but it was just something new.
Aside from integration, do you recall any other historical events occurring that you heard about while you taught here at Newnan?
Well, I think Bobby Kennedy was killed and Martin Luther King was killed. We had Vietnam was still raging. That was an awfully hard time because the men of my generation were in Vietnam. And fortunately, I didn't lose many friends. I did. My brother lost one of his best friends. And it was not a popular war. And I think that the hardest thing for me was to see the Vietnam boys come home, and they were jeered and made to feel that their sacrifices were not important. We had a very, very strong, you know what the 60s were. I mean, all my students always think that I went around in bare feet with a muumuu and flowers in my hair. And that was just totally diverse from what I was. I was just, well, very traditional, as you can see, and I always have been. But, you know, that was a very small segment of the world, and you all probably came up thinking, you know, see a sea of pot and kids, you know, let it be and all that. The South wasn't like that. It really wasn't. Not until the 70s, mid-70s, did that occur. And it angered me terrifically that such a small populace, really, of the country turned on those men who had risked their lives doing what their country asked them to do. And you know, they were really heroes, but they were very, very scarred by that. They really were hurt, deeply hurt by it. And it has taken the war in Iraq for them to be recognized. I was pleased that the president recognized men who were in Vietnam this week, as well as those who were in World War II. And they're finally getting their due, but unfortunately a lot of them are not around to know about it.
Right. All right, that's it.
Anything else that y'all can think of personally you'd like to ask me?
I think I threw in some of my personal questions in there. So.
Anything you're really curious about? You want to be off the record?